So what is policy analysis? Would anyone like to give me a suggestion? Anybody besides Mr. Waseo?
Kind of weighing out the different alternatives to the problem.
That's a key thing you picked up on there, pointing out different alternatives. Indeed, it's not just one policy that's being analyzed. Typically, it's a variety of options. Anyone else? Yes?
Crafton says it's the...
Oh, you're going to the book.
What?
I want you, not the book. I'm going to tell you the book in a minute. I'm just kidding. What does Crafton Furlong say?
Well, that it's about the alternative.
They do say something about the alternatives. The assessment of policy alternatives. That's really just succinct. And the sentence after that's a little more academic. The systemic investigation of alternative policy options and the assembly and integration of the evidence for and against each option. Summing it up, the assessment of alternatives, policy options, and weighing the pros and cons. Weighing one policy against another. How do we do that? There's a process by which we study it. We study a proposed policy or an idea that helps us decide which ones we like and which ones we don't. That's what policy analysis is for. Two key characteristics. First, policy analysis, the idea of assessing alternatives, weighing options, studying policies to distinguish favorable from unfavorable, what we're about to talk about, that can occur at any phase in the process. You can assess a policy at any time. However, it's usually performed on the front end. By that I mean to inform decisions. So as we delve into this decision-making step, we thoroughly reviewed agenda setting. Tonight we'll talk more about the decision-making step. This is really where policy analysis helps policymakers. It helps them make informed decisions. That's the goal of policy analysis. And for that reason, it usually occurs earlier in the process, like in the decision-making phase or prior to a decision being made. And secondly, it's typically prospective in nature. You're looking at ideas and saying, what would happen if we implemented this policy? Well, let's think about it and assess it and set up some criteria for evaluation and then weigh it against some other idea. What happens if either or one of these policies is passed? What are the results that we achieve? Typically prospective in nature. Not always, but typically. And there are 5 steps. And I'm going to give you tonight the key to understanding these 5 steps. Because the text goes into great detail with respect to every step. But it doesn't do so in necessarily the most obvious manner. I, however, as your professor, I'm going to save you some time and explain how each step is explained later in subsequent chapters, what page number you can find that on. It's a bit of a matrix, but it's going to be the key to your success. In some ways, I'm helping you. I'm doing your work for you. But if you look at the 5 steps, page 101 on Crafton Furlong, let's break that out. Steps in the policy analysis process. Let's list these 5 steps first, then I'll tell you a little bit more about each one and where you can find more information in the text. What's our first step? Define and analyze the problem. What's our second step? Construct alternatives. I'm asking and I'm answering. I'm sorry, I shouldn't do that. It's right there in front of you, you know? What am I asking you for? Sometimes I wonder about my teaching methods here. Close your books, just kidding. Develop evaluative criteria. Assess alternatives. And finally, draw conclusions, i.e., decide, make a choice. That's why this process is really fundamental to the decision-making step. You go through all these questions with respect to any particular policy you're analyzing, and then at the end of the day, the goal here is to make a choice or a decision. So that's what you end up with in step number 5. Here's where I'm going to blow your minds, because the key to understanding each of these steps isn't just a cursory review of them. There's actually more information in the subsequent chapter and chapters. So I'm going to give you the key right now. Defining and analyzing the problem, step 1. Something also called problem analysis. Problem analysis process is 6 steps. It's listed on page 135. And we're going to go over all this in a minute. So don't get too concerned. Don't jump ahead. Construct policy alternatives. That is, what can government do? What are the options that you have based on these problems? What can government do? By the way, this is page 135. That's listed on page 139. Once you have your problem identified and your options set out, like what steps can government take, or what are the steps that what can government do to address the problem you've identified, then you can develop some evaluative criteria so that you can weigh your options and see which one's going to get the best results. Based on evaluative criteria, they're laid out on page 154. Those are the keys to understanding this process. The policy analysis process is 5 steps, but within each step, there's a lot of detail and complexity. These other ones aren't as complicated, and they don't require a separate page reference. But these first 3 do. And so I think when you go back and reread this, and as you read more, because you haven't read this stuff yet, you haven't read much about step 3 yet. You probably have read up to this part. And but maybe as you were doing it, it wasn't quite clear how it all fit together. This is the way to think about it fitting together. 5 steps in the policy analysis process. Problem analysis, define the problem. Construct policy alternatives, what the government can do. Develop evaluative criteria. Assess alternatives. Draw conclusions, and make a decision. So that's like the Cliff's Notes of what you need to prepare in the coming weeks. So let's take a look at the first step, defining and analyzing the problem, problem analysis. As I said, if you turn to page 135, this provides us with a really nice list of the components of problem analysis. 6 of them. Define and analyze the problem. Problem analysis, 6 steps. What's the first? Define the problem. Why is that important to policy analysis? Why does this matter so much? Yes.
If you don't define the problem clearly and you don't go into defining like what aspects of the problem you're actually, like the book talks about, like if you're dealing with poverty, you have to define what poor is. If you don't know what you're trying to solve, everything else is just not going to solve the problem.
Absolutely right. Problem definition is a critical step in the policy analysis process because how you define the problem can greatly affect the type of solutions that you propose, the policies that you support, and also whether or not you'll actually be effective in addressing the problem you've identified. I have a couple quick case studies, stories in the news today that I've pulled out. I want you guys to read them. Take a second, read it. I need to have one of those though. So there should be some extras. Extras. Take a second to read this. As you're reading it, think about this in your mind. What is the problem? What is the problem being described here? I'll give you about 5 minutes. Think it over. So you just probably read it once, read it again, and again, the key question, what is the problem? There's no correct or incorrect answer. but I want to try to illustrate how many of us might have different approaches to what this problem is, and how you define the problem will have a really dramatic effect on your proposed solution to it. Who wants to go first? What's the problem? The title suggests the traffic jam is costing you $713. That's pretty significant. Is this a problem of costing people money? I mean, if that's how you define it. If you define it according to the title of this story, how might you solve this problem? Well, I guess we should redistribute some money and make sure people who commute get $713. Then they'd be whole again, right? It's a problem of cost. People are incurring costs because of their commute. We just need to pay them. Obviously, that's tongue-in-cheek. That's not the problem. That's a fun way of casting it, because it sort of relates immediately to any individual, right? What's the problem here? Anyone have an opinion about that? Anybody? Yes?
Too many cars on the road.
Too many cars. Okay, that's certainly one way to look at it. Anyone else?
The layout of the cities, like geographically, like being compact or more sprawled out.
Too many, as a result of that, well, actually, let's go compact cities.
Our current infrastructures don't support the amount of cars we're going to do.
Too many cars or not enough road. How's that? That's two completely different ways of looking at this problem. Those are three good ones. I think related to compact cities is just population density. Anyone else? Those are four good ones. They're pretty common and come right to mind.
City planning is another one to talk about.
That kind of relates to cities, but like urban sprawl was referenced in there. You might even think about the problem as an outdated notion that you physically have to be in a location to do the work that you're doing. And then, so let's talk about that as sort of outdated notions or social notions of physical location and work. Or outdated notions of mass transportation bias. I like to drive myself, you know, that's a cultural. Outdated cultural norms.
Or use of like public transportation.
Right. Okay. So we have a lot of now, depending on how we define this, why is that important? Let's look at the first obvious ones here. Too many cars. That was the first thing. Too many cars. And clearly there are too many cars on the road, which can certainly lead to congestion. If that's how you define the problem, what might you do about that? What are some ways you might approach it to address that problem? That's the only problem I'm talking about here.
Say cars that license plate end in an odd number can drive on these days, even numbers can drive on.
Yeah, you could ration the resource of the road based on, you know, even and odd days. Basically, too many cars. In order to address that, you're going to try to reduce the number of cars on the road. There are a lot of different ways you can do that. We're going to get into this idea of considering your alternatives. But it's really important to note how you define the policy problem will really inform the type of alternatives that you come up with. So if you're just talking about how to get too many cars off the road, you're talking essentially about rationing the highway or restricting the use. Any other ways to address too many cars? How might you address that?
Have maybe an incentive for you to have companies pay for employees' commute costs?
Basically, yeah, incentives to get people out, again, stop people from driving. Pay them to take the subway or to bike. Come up with some way to do that, right? Incentivize alternative behaviors. What's the alternative of incentivizing? What's the opposite of that?
Punish.
Punishing, taxing. Tax these suckers. Make them pay. Make them hurt. Of course, it doesn't go well with this title because they're talking about, you're already getting a hidden tax of $713. So to resolve that problem, we're going to tax you more so you stop driving, right? All right, so let's just stop there for a second because these are all very effective and very different means of addressing this problem. Okay, well, it's a different way. Let's look at it from the standpoint of not enough highway. That's a pretty obvious, right? Like, build more roads. '66, right? That's a big debate. If you build it, they will come. That's sort of the other theory. Like, well, if you expand it another couple lanes, there'll just be more traffic, right? Yeah, but if that's how you identify the problem, well, we don't have enough infrastructure. We don't have the infrastructure to support the traffic. Well, we're not going to worry about the traffic. We're actually just going to build roads so we can make this happen. Or you could even think about private highways. Well, we can't afford public. Right now, it's tough times. So we're going to have private highways that charge high rates, hot lanes. These exist in other states. They're actually talking about, there may be one in Virginia. But the idea being, would you pay more money to have a quicker commute? And if a private company can build a road, there's no cost to the public. A company builds the highway, the couple lanes of road, right alongside 66. So the only way, and that's owned by a private company. And they make the investment, they put all the money into it. It gives you more lanes, but they get to charge rates for those lanes. Other lanes at 66 aren't, you have to pay for those. These you'd have to pay for, and that money goes to the company. Maybe there's some fraction that goes back to the state because they had to have the right-of-way to build the roads. There's some other sort of legal arrangements that could be created. But here we're talking about, hey, let's focus on constructing more roads, right? That's those are policy options that aren't as obvious if you're looking at the question as the problem as one of too many cars. And of course, the other way to look at this is really the result of an underlying problem. How our cities have developed, suburbs, and they reference in the article the idea of telecommuting, and maybe evolving our understanding of what it means to work. Why are we all working from 9 to 5? This is something that I was wondered. I mean, I'm not suggesting I want to change my lifestyle, but you could really dramatically affect traffic patterns. I mean, when you go through DC at midnight, you can cruise through pretty quickly, right? Why aren't people working from 8 o'clock till 5 in the morning?
Well, just like this article says, I've gone out at times where there should be no traffic and there's traffic backed up like 10 p.m. at night, like all the way back on a highway. So I think people are doing random things now.
To try to game the system in a way. But again, this quick story illustrates how you define the problem will affect the type of alternatives you're going to consider. That's why it's critical. That's why it's so important. I have a couple other ones I wanted to pass out. I'm going to pass them out, but I'm not going to ask you to do them today. I'm going to ask you to read them and think about them, and we'll talk in our next class about it because I want to keep going. But here are a couple more problems that I saw in the news. Don't read these right now, but read them before our next class. We'll talk about them next week. I don't want to kill trees in vain. And again, as you read them, think about what is the problem. So when you come to class, be equipped and prepared to answer that question. What is the problem? And just to make sure I got the right ones out, one of those has to do with a lower number of doctors. By the way, I'll show you some leftovers when you're all done there. Pass leftovers up when you're done. So problem definition is essential. How you define the problem will affect the type of alternatives that you consider, the type of solutions you consider. Because if you view the problem as one of too many cars, you're probably not going to be so focused on urban sprawl as an issue. You're going to be thinking about how do I get cars off the highway? What's an immediate way I can do that? Six steps. 1, define problem, which we just explained. Second, measure the problem. So here, once you've defined it, if you define it as too many cars, how do you measure that? Well, you can look at traffic, actually like the volume of cars. You can think about measures that are related to your definition of the problem. And it's important as you look for these measures that they're consistent with how you define the problem. So here's a great example. Mr. Brownstein mentioned this question. A really big issue here is like poverty. What is the problem? How do you define the problem of poverty? If you define poverty as a problem based on lack of capital or money, people are poor because they don't have money. The measures you should look for, if that's the way you define the problem, the measures you should be looking for are those related to things like disposable income, savings, property, owning or renting things. Those are the type of measures you're looking at, and maybe you try to find ways to address those problems. But if you define problem as something that's more, it's sort of bigger than that, has to do with lack of skills or training, then you would look at measures like the education level of the people that are poor. There's the family unit, cohesion, things like that, drug addiction. Those are the measures you'd be looking at. You wouldn't be looking at those measures if you thought it was an issue of, simply just an issue of money. So how you define the problem affects the measures that you should be looking for. And an important thing to understand about measures is you want to always think about things as in relation to. So it's easy to say, traffic jam is costing you $713. That's interesting. That's a measure. Someone's calculated that. But what makes it stand out isn't because it's $713, which seems like in an independent metric, $713 could be a lot of money or not much money. Right? Depends. In relation to what? And they do a great job here of relating it to 1982, where it was $300. So it's like almost a doubling in the costs. One big careful thing about how you measure and where you go to get these measures. And this article really highlighted it too. First of all, did anyone wonder, like, what is the Texas Transportation Institute doing assessing Washington, D.C.? Well, it's part of a national survey, so let's be fair. But who are they? What's their agenda? What's their goal? What's their motive? It's often the case that places you go to get these numbers and data have a particular worldview or perspective or bias. Possibly, hopefully not. So be careful about where you go to get the measurements for your problem. Because the people that are giving you the measures might be trying to give you measures that are convenient for their policy solutions, which may benefit them in some way. And it's interesting to note that, there's an update to this article. Not everyone agrees with the Texas Transportation Institute. There's a new group, CEOs for Cities. They have their own analysis. And again, the discrepancies in their solutions really relate to how they define the problem. It's pretty fascinating. After you measure the problem, you want to determine the extent or magnitude of the problem. And here, again, is where you're looking for relationships. Time series data. Is most useful. How much, what is this data, what are the trends? Because you need something to compare that data to in order to try to understand what's going on, how you can measure that problem, how drastic it really is. Consider the causes of the problem. This is on page 135 again. What are the problem's causes? How did the problem come about? This is really related a lot to the first step, in my opinion. Who's affected, how much, how did it come about, and why does it continue? Consider causes of problem. Set goals or objectives. What should be done about the problem? And finally, what actions might work to solve the problem? So this is a problem analysis. It's a part of the policy analysis process. It's the first step, and there are 6 elements to it. There is some relationship between these steps and policy analysis more broadly. So setting goals and objectives, step 5, is a lot like or plays into step 3 when you're talking about evaluative criteria. What are your goals? How are you going to measure success? That can also be related to the third step in the policy, of the 5 steps of policy analysis. The 6th step, what actions might work to solve the problem, kind of plays into step 2. Where you're constructing your policy alternatives. What can government do? What actions might work? What specific steps might be helpful? They are still all part of problem analysis. All of these collectively fit into here, number 1, but I'm suggesting there's a lot of fluidity here. That some of these steps in problem analysis can relate to or inform other subsequent steps of the 5-step policy analysis process. Is this making sense? I know it's a little complicated. You should be able to see these relationships. And all of this that we just talked about, and that newspaper article I handed out, that exercise, all that's related to this one step. Okay? And as you're reading, page 135 and the corresponding pages around there, that's descriptive of defining and analyzing a problem, the first step of the process. That's how it all links together. The second step, construct policy alternatives. What can government do? So once you define the problem, once you fully define it, using these 6 steps, what can government do? Page 139. Not an exhaustive list, but a very comprehensive one. All the various actions that government can take. Regulation, subsidizing, rationing, taxing, spending, contracting out, privatizing, using market incentives, charging fees, public education campaigns, and on and on. There's a litany of options here. What options you will pick will be heavily influenced by how you define the problem. But just because you define the problem in a certain way doesn't mean you're limited in some way to what government can do to solve it. I'm going a little quickly because I want to get through one more thing before the night's out. And we can review this again next week. But I'm trying to connect all the dots. You guys should be seeing this. Hopefully you saw a little bit of it when you were reading. But now as you read even further into the next chapter, you'll really be able to put all the pieces together. Because the next step, once you think about what government can do, here are some of the options, the alternatives, the ideas that we have. Well, we can tax the cars, or we can subsidize them for not driving, right? All those things we were talking about. Then you develop your evaluative criteria. How do we assess these options that we've defined? We have some ideas. We have some possible solutions. Well, how do we know which one's the best? How do we weigh them against each other? We've identified the problem. We've come up with some neat ideas to solve it. Now we need to know how to assess these ideas. Evaluative criteria. Page 154. You haven't read this chapter yet. You will this week. And we'll have more discussion next week about these various ways we can evaluate competing policy ideas. Again, define the problem, come up with some solutions based on how you define the problem. Now we're going to evaluate all those solutions on certain criteria. And the weight that we put on some criteria versus others will yield sort of an idea. When you assess the alternatives, it'll then give you an ability to draw a conclusion and come up with the best choice based on those criteria. The top three are the most common: effectiveness, efficiency, equity. We've talked about those. But there are others, and this again is not an exhaustive list. You can look at the effects on liberty and personal freedom, political feasibility of the idea, of the solution, the social acceptability, the administrative feasibility, whether or not it could actually be achieved or overseen by a bureaucracy, and the technical feasibility of the solution. Again, define the problem, come up with alternatives or various competing policy ideas based on the way you've defined the problem, evaluate those ideas, those policy solutions, assess them based on these criteria you developed, and draw a conclusion. Make a decision. That's the purpose of policy analysis. It's not just to go through this exercise, it's actually to inform a choice and make a decision. I mean, that's, I think, the outcome we all hope when we enter this process. Because you spend a lot of time looking at problems, thinking of ways to solve them, weighing the pros and cons based on different criteria. Ultimately, the goal is to inform a decision so that a policymaker can make a decision to support a particular policy solution. That's the purpose, primarily, of policy analysis.